Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so glad that you've taken time to join us. We're very busy here in Arkansas getting ready for a possible vaccine, and so I'm really happy to be able to talk to you and share with you some of the things that we've learned and we're getting ready for. So let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about the vaccines under development and how the process works and when we might get them in Arkansas exactly. So let's just review a little bit about the timeline. So you can see that in December was really when the illness of COVID-19 first became recognized. And just within a week, they had identified it as a new coronavirus, and they named it the SARS coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2 for short. And after they had recognized its as the cause of the illnesses, they were able to do the genetic sequencing of the virus and publish it on the internet. So researchers around the world had the opportunity to look at it and use that for their preparation for whatever work they were doing. Well, there were some people who were ready to use it to make a vaccine. So they took this sequence and they used it in their what we call vaccination platform, their method for making a vaccine, and they were able to determine the gene for the spike protein on the surface of the virus and knew its design and could make a vaccine just within days, so that by the end of or the mid-March, two companies, Moderna and Pfizer, were both able to begin studies looking at the safety and efficacy of the vaccines they had prepared using this the known sequence for this spike protein. So that's very fast for coming up with a vaccine candidate. It used to take months and years to do that, but now in the last, say, 10 or 20 years, the vaccine technology has changed so much that it's possible to come up with a vaccine candidate within days. There are currently a lot of different SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in development. This is taken from the New York Times, and if you have an interest in this, you can just Google New York Times vaccine tracker and read about all the different vaccines. Around the world, there's 31 now that are in human studies. In human studies, once they're out of the lab and they've tested them sometimes in animals, then they begin human studies. They do a phase 1 and a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial. The phase 1 trials, just a few people, you give the vaccine to the people who've agreed to participate, and then you use that trial to make sure it's safe to give it to people. You study their immune response, and then you try to figure out what's the appropriate dose for the vaccine. And then phase 2, there's 15 right now, and you're doing more of the safety trial, but now you're trying to see, does this vaccine really work to prevent the illness? If it all goes well in phase 2, then normally you would move on to phase 3. And these are very large trials where you're trying to get enough subjects enrolled in your trial so you can compare the people who got the vaccine and the people who got the placebo to see if it makes a difference in terms of protection for the people who got the vaccine. Around the world, there are already 6 vaccines that are approved for limited use. They're still being studied, but there is no vaccine right now that is fully approved for use in the world. So for us in the US, we have 4 vaccines that are in or near the end of the phase 3 clinical trials. We have one vaccine that is very close to beginning its phase 3 trial, and then there's 4 of them that are in 1 and 2. And in the case of this SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development, they have been combining some of the trials because they have had the funding available that allows them to do that. In the U.S., the vaccine development for the COVID-19 vaccines is being facilitated to move faster through Operation Warp Speed. This is a partnership with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that includes the CDC, the National Institutes of Health. It also includes BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. This is a government agency. Many people aren't familiar with it, but they're very involved in vaccine development. And the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense is working on a lot of the logistics. For example, they work to put into place contracts with companies to make millions and millions of the little vials that you need to put the vaccine in when it's manufactured in large numbers. And they're also working with other companies, of course, to make the numbers of syringes and all the other things you need to do widespread vaccination. So I mentioned a little bit about the different trials. And so I've heard many people express concern that the vaccines are going to be made available so much more quickly than they ever have been before. It's natural for people to think, well, they must be cutting corners on the safety and efficacy studies. Otherwise, how could that happen? But actually, that is not really the case. So I thought it might be helpful to explain that to you. So the traditional development, you work in preclinical studies trying to find a good vaccine candidate, something that's going to work in a vaccine. And you do all kinds of studies in animals. But a lot of this work had already been done with a lot of these platforms. When you get to the point where you want to work on do studies in humans, you apply to the FDA for an investigational new drug application. And then you start your phase 1 trials, of course, which is mostly about safety. Is it safe to give this vaccine to humans, and what's the right dose? If that goes well, then you do a small phase 2 trial trying to see, does this vaccine safe also, but it's also, does it really work? And if it goes well, then you move it to a much larger phase 3 trial. And phase 3 trials for COVID-19 vaccines are anywhere between 30 and 65 or more thousand participants in the US. So, and then after they go through this sequence and they have data to show that the vaccine is both safe and effective, they bring their data to the FDA and they apply for a biologics license application, and then they review it, and it takes them a long time to do it. And then if they approve it, then the vaccine manufacturer scales up its production and makes millions of doses to serve the population. Some of you may have gotten the shingles vaccine a few years ago, and you may remember or have experienced a delay in being able to get the vaccine. And this is because once it was approved by the FDA and recommended by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, it took a while for the vaccine manufacturer to ramp up the production and begin to produce the number of doses needed to meet public demand. So this all can take a very long process to do. So what they've done for COVID-19 vaccination is they had already done a lot of the preclinical studies on many of the vaccine platforms, and they had good experience with the original SARS epidemic and the vaccines. They had worked on it in the early 2000s. And there's a related illness called MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and they had learned from it. So they could do these studies just within months. They then were ready to submit their investigational new drug application. And because of the funding that was available, the phase 1 was able to start, and some of them were combined with phase 2, so phase 2 carried on. And in other cases, phase 2 was combined with phase 3, so that you didn't have to use a small group first. You could ramp up already and have a big group being studied to get a result more quickly. At the same time, while these vaccines are being, the phase 2 and 3 and trials are being conducted for these vaccines, they are already ramping up, scaling up the manufacturing process, and have already made millions of doses of these vaccines. So that by the time the FDA receives the application and reviews it, they can review it in a few weeks, it could be, or a month or two. They are able to use these vaccines already manufactured to make them immediately available if the FDA authorizes the use of any of these vaccines. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is while these studies are going on, there is an independent data and safety monitoring board. So while the trial is going on, the FDA and the drug companies that are developing these vaccines are not able to see what's happening in their trial in terms of their data results. They are blinded to it. But there is a board that's independent of the drug companies or the FDA that constantly reviews the data, and it's held in privacy, so that in the event it becomes clear that there's something not safe about this vaccine, they can take action. And we have seen that with a couple of the vaccines, that a patient in the drug study or in the trial had something happen to them. And so they could pause the trial and look and see what happened. Was this related to the vaccine or not? And then if it was not thought to be related, they can resume it. But if there's a big safety issue with the vaccine, they can completely stop the trial and discontinue it. So far, that hasn't happened. And the vaccines so far are looking very good in terms of their safety. The 4 vaccines that are in the phase 3 trial are the Moderna, the Pfizer vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And the one that is going to start pretty soon is the Novavax. So Moderna and Pfizer are both RNA vaccines, and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are both viral vector vaccines. And then the Novavax is a protein subunit vaccine. So I want people to know that safety has not been short-circuited. They haven't cut corners on any of these trials. In fact, both the FDA and the CDC have advisory committees. FDA is called the VRBPAC for short, but it's the Vaccines and Related Biologics Products Advisory Committee. And the CDC has a committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And they have both placed safety above all the other criteria. If it's not safe, it cannot be used. Then I mentioned before the Independent Data and Safety Monitoring Board that oversees the data during the course of the study to make sure that there is nothing concerning about safety for any of these vaccines. And then, the other thing that they're watching for any vaccine, there are some potential risks. If the antibodies that are made or that the vaccine stimulates aren't the right kind of antibodies, it can actually enhance the disease, make it worse than if they hadn't had the vaccine at all. And this can happen also in terms of enhanced respiratory disease. We have seen that recently in some vaccines. There was a vaccine recently made for dengue virus. Now, dengue is a very troublesome mosquito-transmitted virus. If you get infected with one of those viruses, I think there's 4 different ones of the dengue virus. If you get infected with one, your illness is not that bad. But if you get bit by another mosquito and you get one of the other viruses after already having had the first one, it can make you really sick. And it was found that the vaccine was doing the same thing. So they've had to stop those or work a different strategy for providing those vaccines. So that's an example of an antibody-dependent enhancement. And so just to kind of show you the whole process for a vaccine being reviewed and used in the U.S., the vaccine goes through its development and testing, which I've shown you about those 3 trials. And when those trials are completed, they submit to the FDA a biologics license application. And the FDA would usually license the vaccine if it met all of their criteria. And then once the FDA licenses the vaccine, the CDC considers it to be recommended. How should the vaccine be used? Who should receive that vaccine? What age groups? Are there any safety or precautions that should be taken into consideration when administering the vaccine, and so forth? So that licensure process is informed by VRBPAC, and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices informs the CDC's consideration. In fact, the ACIP votes, and it's one of the few independent bodies that actually makes policy in the U.S. One of the considerations here is that when a vaccine is licensed by the FDA, not only do they license the biological product that's given in the injection, they also license the whole manufacturing process as well as the process by which it's stored, so that you can be sure that the vaccine is made in a consistent way and that it's stored in a way that it doesn't lose its effectiveness. So that whole process can take more than a year. So in this situation with the COVID-19 vaccines, they're considering using an emergency use authorization for the vaccines. It's not because they're not holding to the same safety standards in terms of the studies and the development of the vaccine, but they do not want to wait a whole year before releasing the vaccine, because in the meantime, thousands of people are dying. So it's a balance between licensing those processes and approving the vaccine for use in a timely way. So I'm going to talk about once the vaccine is, any vaccine is approved, there's an ongoing review of the vaccine and how it performs in the general population. If the COVID-19 vaccine is approved under the emergency use authorization, they will continue to carefully monitor it to make sure that the benefit of the vaccine clearly outweighs the risks. And they will also use it to gather additional data so they can learn more about it if there are side effects. They find that in vaccines, all of the common side effects are identified within about 2 months after a person gets the injection. It's the more rare side effects that you cannot identify in a phase 3 trial. Some of the rare adverse events from vaccines that we know about may occur in 1 out of every 100,000 or even 1 out of every million people who receives the vaccine. And clearly, those adverse events are so rare, you wouldn't pick up on them in a safety, in a phase 3 trial. So they're monitored ongoing after they're approved for use in the general population or for the populations that they're licensed for. And then what they do is the efficacy of the vaccine is how well does it work under the controlled conditions of the studies, the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. But later on, when it's more widely used after those trials are completed, they study the effectiveness. How well does it work once it's released for more wide use? They continue to monitor that. And they're wanting to learn different things about the effect of the vaccines. So, for example, if someone gets vaccinated and it prevents them from getting disease, could they still get the virus and carry it and infect other people even though they don't have the illness? So those are the kinds of things they'll be looking for. We also want to know how long does the protection that the vaccine gives a person last? It's not likely that the SARS-CoV-2 infection develops lasting immunity, and it could be that the vaccines won't either. But how long would it last, and would we need boosters every so often, every 3 or 5 years or something like that? And they also want to be able to study what are the how can you run tests in terms of how the immune system responds to the vaccine so that you can predict later on whether another vaccine is working or not without having to wait a long, long time to see if people get the virus or not. And that's really important because if we get to the point where there is not a lot of virus circulating, it will be harder to see how effective the vaccine is. One of the reasons the trials right now in the US can be so short is because there's so much transmission of COVID-19 going on in the US that the study population is readily exposed and you can see who's protected or who's not. And then they're going to continue to monitor whether they get any hint of enhanced disease, even in subpopulations. So far, not, but we will wait and see. And so the safety after a vaccine is released is really important. And we have several systems in place in the US to monitor it. One is there's the vaccine adverse event reporting system. So anyone who gets a vaccine and experiences an adverse response or something happens and they get sick and you aren't even sure if the vaccine did it or not, you can report it. The public can report it. Doctors can report it. Anybody can report it online or a telephone call or fax. And then especially we want people to report things early on because these vaccines will be new. And if, you know, lots of people are starting to report a certain kind of thing, certain side effect, then what they do is they go to the vaccine safety data link. And this is several healthcare organizations like Kaiser Permanente. They keep databases, of course. They have complete medical records of all of the participants in their healthcare system. And so they can see who got the vaccine, who didn't, and they can run statistical analysis on the people in their organization. So this whole system covers about 24 million people. So you would more likely be able to pick up on a rare side effect of a vaccine. The FDA also uses health insurance claims that cover about 190 million people to see if they can also pick up on a correlation between a vaccine and certain kinds of claims in the health insurance systems. And then there's another group, a clinical immunization safety assessment group. Then these are medical research centers in the US that conduct research on actually, you know, what causes these adverse events or what's likely to happen and how can you avoid them. So the vaccine will be made available to all adults in America at no cost, out-of-pocket cost to them. The government has purchased the vaccine. The U.S. government's paying for it. So it won't be any out-of-pocket costs to the patient. The clinics and the pharmacies and the hospital that administer vaccine can bill for administering the doses. So if you have insurance, your insurance will cover the cost of administering the vaccine. And for those that don't have insurance, then there's a process being worked out where it can bill to the Department of Health and Human Services. So it won't be any out-of-pocket cost. Cost will not be a barrier to anyone. So assuming that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine are available in Arkansas sometime in December, then the doses, as I mentioned, aren't going to be enough to vaccinate everyone. So we will make those vaccines available to the highest priority groups, as I mentioned, healthcare workers and likely persons who are 65 and older, and also other persons at risk for severe disease if they get it of any age. Now, I did want to say that these vaccines are just being rolled out for adults. They will not be available yet for children. So we'll get those initial allotments, and every state will get an allotment or an allocation based on population, and they'll be rolling in perhaps on a weekly basis. So by the time we can get to we get all the high priority groups vaccinated, it might be a few months. So I would say perhaps in about April, the general population will be there'll be enough vaccine for everyone that wants to get one to get a vaccine. And then we'll have to wait and see about the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They may roll out in the spring also with their initial doses. And so we may have the luxury of having 4 different types of vaccine available. And so we'll be trying to use them strategically as to what populations they're best for. The ACIP will help us with recommendations for who should get which vaccine. And I'm looking forward. I think the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, if I remember right, is just 1 dose. So that will be a plus also.
And Patrick Mathau ask the fun question here. Is the state equipped to face this logistical challenge?
Well, I would say yes and no. So the Arkansas Department of Health has been practicing giving flu vaccines in mass dispensing for a long time. Every fall we do it through drive-through clinics, through large walk-up clinics, and we've had to modify that because obviously you don't want people lining up in a small area to get their COVID vaccine because you'll spread COVID while you're doing it. So we are actually pivoting so that we can partner with pharmacies around the state to give vaccine. And we're working with our county offices of emergency management to help them manage the logistics of that, because they've been helping the health department do it for many years. So they know about how to do the traffic flow and all those things. And then a lot of the vaccine will be deployed potentially to hospitals or to pharmacies that will take it and vaccinate people in long-term care. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I hope that you will think kindly of us here at the health department because things change on an hourly basis and we're having to pivot and turn. But the amazing thing is that people in the hospital systems, the pharmacy systems, emergency management, all these people are willing to come together and help. And I hope Rotarians will help too. If there's a pharmacy in your community that's doing one of these events where they're trying to vaccinate a lot of people, go and help. That would be a wonderful advantage to them, is to have just people who can help with the intake forms or to do something that's non-medical, if you're a non-medical person, they'll need, it'll be all hands on deck. And, we will all need help, and we got to help each other.